The Reverend Dr. PaulSiaki is a third-generation minister and full-time missionary for OC Africa. He was previously pastoring in Soweto and has been involved in planting 3 new churches. He is a guest lecturer of missiology at the University of Pretoria and teaches seminar models on gospel and culture, fresh expressions, and coaching. Paul has previously addressed us at Inspire on the topic of becoming church unusual, a title of his other book. Paul holds a doctorate in missiology from Biola University in Southern California, USA. He is married to Barbara and has 3 grown children. They have lived in Johannesburg since 1998, and unfortunately, he is an ardent fan of the All Blacks.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time you happen to be catching this video. It is great to be with you again. I do hope you watched the whole thing. If for nothing else, for the cash prizes that are offered at random times throughout the entire talk. I'm just saying you don't want to miss out. I'm Paul Siaki, and some of you have seen me before. So it is a great honor and privilege to be back with you again, even if it is by a virtual platform this time. I'm an Anglican priest in the Diocese of Johannesburg, helping out primarily at St. Martin's in Rosebank. I do a number of ministries that primarily relate to church planting, mission, and coaching. Also do some guest lecturing at Tucky's, and some of you have been in those classes. This talk is related to my latest book entitled Church Interrupted or Church Reset, What Will the Post-COVID Church Look Like? Now, if you haven't obtained a copy yet, let me encourage you to just run out. Now, you won't find it at bookstores, but I will give you the information at the very end on how you can get a copy of the book. Boxing theologian Mike Tyson once said, "Everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth." Well, we, the whole world and the church, just got punched in the mouth, didn't we? And all our plans went out the door. So how do we get up from the canvas and get back into the fight? But the even bigger question is it the same fight? So, about every 100 years or so, God does something to shake up the world and the church along with it. And it's funny how after these shakeups, there are advances in art and science after pandemics or crises. We're all familiar with the Spanish flu. People refer to 1918 to 1920. I mean, COVID-19 is almost to the year 100 years later. But the things that came out of these pandemics or whatever, the Gutenberg Press, Renaissance, Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, indoor plumbing. Actually, I'm not sure when that was invented. You can find more details, by the way, of anything I talk about today that is in my book, so you don't have to worry too much about taking frantic notes or anything. So there are going to be 2 questions that we're going to look at primarily today, and because of time, we're going to concentrate on just kind of one of them. So the 2 questions. Firstly, is the post-COVID church going to simply wait out this imposed, the hard lockdown, and then we go back to life as normal, or try to, or, see what will happen? Or is the second option, is the post-COVID church going to see this as a divine reset? See this pandemic as an opportunity, not a detriment, a chance to do something different with this opportunity that we have been given. Now, you may not have actually thought about these questions coming out of the worst of the pandemic now as things are loosening up. Perhaps today is the day you think about them and see how that might change your paradigms and your actions. So, is church interrupted or divinely disrupted? One of the early futurists, well known back in the 70s and 80s, says the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Powerful statement. A colleague of mine was in a conference, a virtual conference, and they had a breakout group, and each person was talking about what the pandemic meant to them, what was going to happen. And they got to one pastor, and the pastor said, I just want everything to go back to normal. I can't wait for everything to go back to where it was. And he said it was odd because the group felt awkward because those in the group knew they were not going to go back. You can no longer lead, manage, minister, or worship in the ways of the old, from a past paradigm and model. Welcome to the new world. Remember what Christ said about new wineskins? You weren't sure that he was actually talking to you, did you? Matthew 9:17. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. I say we stop calling it a pandemic and call it new wine time. Let everyone be completely intrigued by what Christians are talking about. The first example, when you look at these verses, is that something is lost, but we're really stubborn, and we keep trying to put the genie back in the bottle. We keep trying to put, this old stuff into the wineskins. The second example is that if we seize the opportunity given us, we have great wine and great wineskins, and there's a major party down the road where we'll be celebrating. That choice is up to you. In this time of uncertainty and discomfort, you must learn to make decisions one day, change them the next, and then learn a new way of doing things the following day, and then change it all over again on Thursday. Gone are the good old days. Are you familiar with the expression, burn the ships? Maybe you have heard this before, but it's an old legend about when Cortez was conquering the New World in Mexico, and they had sailed over, and they had gone on to the peninsula, and they were going to try and take over this colonized new civilization, and his sailors and soldiers began to complain about the hardships of their lives together there. And so what Cortez did was he ordered for all the ships to be burned. There was no going back. They were committed to this new way, this new path, the future, and so there was no way around it. There's no going back to what was. We have to look ahead and plan for a brighter future. Not necessarily a quick, brighter future, because it might take a while. But we can no longer go back. We can't keep looking back. And one of the reasons that this is so important is what might be happening to our people out there. Nancy Ammerman, who is a professor of sociology of religion at Boston University, considers that beyond shrinking congregations, pandemic-linked defections could fuel a broader decline in religious behavior. She says, people who stop attending church rarely develop or maintain spiritual practices at home. I mean, if there's no community to give you a feeling of obligation and of belonging, it's very tempting to simply not do anything. The better tactic for religious leaders worried about their shrinking flocks might be to highlight how difficult it is to stay engaged with faith on your own. Once people drop out of a regular congregation, they rarely keep up with their original spiritual plans. Okay, now we're going to talk about what I'm really getting at. Church Reset. And I'll open up with a quote from C.S. Lewis. This is a really interesting quote. There exists in every church something that sooner or later works against the very purpose for which it came into existence. So we must strive very hard, by the grace of God, to keep the church focused on the mission that Christ originally gave to it. Powerful. Reset. You know, when you look at that word in the dictionary, you get a number of definitions. And this is one of my favorites: to move something back to an original place or position. To reset is to go back to an original place or position. And I didn't even add the something. That was like from Mr. Oxford Dictionary. And I think that something is the church. To go back to the original position. What if God is trying to shake things up and get people's attention? What if God, the sovereign ruler of the universe, as he has done throughout time, has decided that he's going to shake the world up, and his church along with it, and see if he can't get people's attention? Is he not allowed to do something new? And throughout history, crisis is an accelerator and an innovator. And so that's where you're at. We can't just sit back and not do anything. And we can't just do the old stuff. Let's create new pathways. And I don't need to be telling you about the Missio Dei. You all know about the mission of God. And you are probably trying to do everything you can to tap into it. So I would encourage you, abandon the centuries-old paradigm of being a static institution and embrace God's first and most compelling call on your life, the mission of God. What if instead of seeing this as just an opportunity to put more bums in seats, we saw this as an opportunity for the church to lean more heavily into its role as an agent that would equip and deploy the faithful as they engage in mutual relationships with people in much smaller communities, actually. 2, 3, 4, a dozen, okay? Wherever those people happen to be. I mean, imagine if our members were encouraged and taught to be people who actually listened to their neighbors, engaged with them about their struggles and their longings, and then helped them learn about how God was in fact active in their life, and that there was these answers from God. In other words, imagine if we actually equip people to be the church rather than attend church, or worse, watch church. So, what can happen during this radical reset? When everything seems to turn upside down, friends, there is an opportunity to stop some things that had not been working anyway, eliminate some things that were seemingly impossible in normal times, right? And start new things that might have been hard to imagine in the past. Ask yourself, why were you born during a time which included 2019 to 2020, whatever, when this all goes away? Just to say to your grandkids that you lived through the great COVID pandemic of 2019? I don't think so. There just has to be something more, right? God is in control, and he always has a plan. What if his plan is a reset? What if 100 years from now, people will look back and say, wow, that church got rocked, but they rolled with it and transformed the church and the nation. Later, I'll just make an allusion to how our Christian ancestors stayed during plagues and how it was so instrumental in changing their society. But what if this is our turn to shine, our turn to do something to make a difference in the world? Okay? So again, my not so hidden agenda, if you read the book, all right? I believe God has given us a reset. I think the Great Commission should now be our top priority, and we should see it as the great opportunity. Okay? A reset to go back to the original blueprint of making disciple-making disciples. More than at any time in our lifetime, we are going to have to question, why does the church exist? Why do we as Christians exist? And it may be that you've been in just kind of a maintenance mode for a while, and this pandemic has kind of shaken you up. And maybe you've got some questions and you've been wondering, what can I do? What should I be doing? If you think about how Christianity is half of the world's population, in terms of affiliation at least, then shouldn't the world be a better place? I mean, shouldn't we be the ones saying that this is an opportunity? Not just an interruption or disruption, but a brand new start. What if the best is now in front of us? What if the best is yet to come? An uncharted landscape, the most interesting terrain still remains to be explored. The best is yet to come. And are we really a Christian nation? Does anyone want to guess the percentage of Christian affiliation in South Africa? Yes, I see your hand in the back. You've probably all heard it. Somewhere above 80%, depending on what research or which research group figures that you happen to use. 80% of South Africans say they affiliate with Christianity. I mean, do we see 44 million people in our churches, or coming through our churches, our doors, or even admitting going to church even once? You know, here's a story that you just might not believe. Years ago, the BBC got permission to follow a group of carjackers for a week. And on the first night, they gathered with all that they were doing, put out their weapons and their plans, where they were going to go, what they were going to do. And then, before they got started, they stood in a circle, and they held hands, and they prayed. They prayed that God would give them protection. They prayed that God would give them success. They prayed that God would allow them to do what they needed to do, get the things, and then go back to their families and be safe. And they prayed about a number of things. And later that week, the BBC recorded that one of the hijacking victims was killed. It's terrible if you think about that. You know, a serious flaw in their understanding of what they think Christianity is. But how is that any different to the person sitting in the pew in church who is sharply dressed, smug and happy, and looks the part of the Christian? Because they're, doing things a different way, but they stole millions of rands earmarked for PPE during the lockdown. Or the fact that our politicians have to publicly state that they will do everything in their power to not have our public officials steal the money that is going to KZN for relief purposes. I don't know if you saw the other day, I think it was an Eastern Cape politician who told people in a large conference that they should take the bribe when it is offered, but to, quote, do the right thing. Like people know what the right thing to do is when they're told to go ahead and take a bribe as their baseline of morality, or what they're supposed to be doing. How will the nation be transformed to truly be like Christ? I mean, if everyone is saying it's at 80%. Why were we the murder capital of the world for a while? We are still the rape and carjacking capital. We're high on robbery and assault. Why are we second only to Brazil in the gap between rich and poor? The UN list of 144 most dangerous countries came out. You won't believe it, we are third on that list. I just saw an article about the Worldwide Corruption Index. All other African countries had an average about 33%. South Africa is 11 points higher at 44 markers. How can this be? If we're 80% plus. Sociologists say anywhere from as little as 2% to up to 25%. can transform a group, a nation. So, I'm going to talk to you and say that there's going to be a mixed economy and for you to stand in the gap. Wherever you are, whoever you are, you will do two brave and crucial things once you are finished watching this video. I believe in you. Firstly, you will do everything in your power to minister to those who have not returned, whether they are digital viewers or not. And secondly, you will do everything in your power to make disciples who make disciples. Okay? It's like a mixed economy of God's grace and mission. You're going to do both these things with equal fervor and energy. I mean, remember the story of Esther and how she stood in the gap, right? We don't have time to go through it all, but remember, she found out about the plot to kill all the Jews. She tells Mordecai, yes, Mordecai, I think, and she says, okay, I've done my job. I've told you, but I can't help. And then he kind of gets the message back to her and says, do you imagine that this annihilation, this thing, will skip you, will miss you? You'll be just as bad. I mean, it'll be just as bad for you. So he said, you need to stand in the gap. Maybe you were born for such a time as this. Maybe that's you, friends. Born for such a time as this. And sure, maybe there's no annihilation coming for you, I think. But I fully believe that you are standing at a pivotal point in history. You, now, here. Maybe that's why you were born for this time period. To stand in the gap and make disciples to transform nations. Jesus commanded us to make disciples over 2,000 years ago. And now maybe he's giving you your major chance to do so. You're at a pivotal time in history. You, right now. So how do we leverage the great opportunity before us? Not complaining and always looking over our back at what was and is now lost and gone, but gazing instead with enthusiasm to this future and moving forward. There was a saying that was started 100 years ago. You make the path as you walk it. This is your chance to blaze a path forward. Jesus might even ask, why are you doing what I said I would do? Build my church, and not doing what I commanded you to do. Make making disciples. Biblical history shows us that Paul made disciples before churches were formed. Jesus and Paul practiced form following function. They knew that if you make disciple-making disciples, the result was always a biblically functioning community, Jesus' church. But it is not necessarily true that if you build the church first, then you'll get disciples. The post-COVID church must be in love and engaged with the mission of God, and therefore must make it their number one priority. I love what Tom Sine writes about this. He says, every denomination and religious organization I have worked with does long-range planning. Ironically, they do long-range planning as though the future will simply be an extension of the present. Just an extension. As a result, we are chronically surprised by change. In the future, we can no longer afford this luxury. I love that line. We are chronically surprised by change. That's the church. We're chronically surprised. You'll find in my book, I talk about the diffusion of innovation and just how you have the early adopters, the laggards, and all that. But we're always surprised by change. One of the leading missiologists in the world, Alan Hirsch, he writes, missional church is a community of God's people that defines itself and organizes its life around its real purpose of being an agent of God's mission to the world. I love that phrase. Organizes itself. I mean, wow. Think about it. What if every church council, deacon board, staff meeting, planning meeting, whatever, you name it, kept asking the question when something came up, yes, but does this help accomplish the mission of God? Friends, can you imagine if we actually had that in our churches? If every time we were looking at something, someone would say, yeah, but is this accomplishing the mission of God? Wow. And Hirsch continues, the mission of God flows directly through every believer and every community of faith that adheres to Jesus. To obstruct this is to block God's purposes in and through his people. I mean, what's at the core of being a Christ follower, right? The act of disciple making is at the heart of the church. Say it with me. We are a Jesus movement. We are called to be his disciples, right? To try and be more like Christ. It is knowing him better and experiencing life as if he were in our bodies, our clothes. That's what discipleship is all about. Okay? If he was here on earth physically, we would be following him around and trying to do everything that he did. It's the same way they did in first century Palestine. They followed rabbis. The simplicity of our faith is that we are all about Jesus and living life out as he would. Now, here's another great quote from C.S. Lewis. The church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. Wow. God became man for no other purpose. That's powerful. You know, there's a simple but huge problem in our faith today. Not enough Christians are making disciples. It is no longer the DNA of the church today. It's about a lot of other things. And we need to get back to first things first. We need to be making disciples, right? We need to go back to doing that. So what is our primary duty? The pandemic gives us the opportunity to transform our church structures, put money to our top priority, and to go back to basics and make disciples. Now, it could be that maybe some of you, I've talked with many people during this time, and they think there's a greater need for evangelism. And I think evangelism is great and, of course, is needed. Maybe whatever word you might use, outreach, witnessing, whatever it is. But I would even suggest that you even pull back a little bit, because sometimes when we talk about evangelism, our churches right now, we'll get people who just turn off. They'll say, I've heard about it. I'm not an evangelist. I don't do this kind of thing. Blah, blah, blah. But the world now and the church world has really changed here in South Africa. It's not about evangelizing those who never heard of Jesus or don't know anything about the Bible. South Africans know quite a lot about the Bible, actually. The flaw is found in the application. And this needs people to come alongside and provide guidance, input, accountability, mentoring, understanding, and love. We are working with a society that has a spiritual, supernatural worldview. And what they really need is a conversation that involves how this natural world interacts with the spiritual world and what difference that's supposed to make in their lives. Because most people just don't know. They don't know. Take a bribe, do the right thing, what? And they're making the wrong decisions. Mike Breen, he quotes the unconventional character of disciple making. If you make disciples, you always get the church. But if you make a church, you rarely get disciples. We are all missionaries. If you're watching this right now, you've been exhorting your churches or groups or whatever it might be to be missionaries, right? We are all his witnesses and we are all his disciple makers. And it might seem like a daunting task, but it's as simple as asking someone to have coffee with you and talk as you tell your people, as you try and equip them. That's what it is. It's just this simple act. Roy Moran, he powerfully writes, "To be a follower of Christ is to be on mission." I think Jesus would find foreign the concept of a person becoming a Christian but not becoming a disciple until later, when he or she becomes more committed to faith. To fail to make disciples would indicate followers weren't connected to Jesus and the heart of his mission. Now, I want to share a tough statement with you for church leaders and anyone who seriously wants to fulfill the Great Commission. You must be willing to advance the kingdom of God, even if it means that you do not increase your Sunday morning service attendance. Just hold that position for a second. And that is no easy position to hold. And I'm saying this to you from the perspective and position of having been a pastor since 1990, ordained in 1990. But I absolutely believe that God honors those who put the Missio Dei first and foremost in their lives and in the life of their congregations. What that will translate to, I cannot tell you. But if you're worried about money and your job, realize this: true, fully discipled Christians become actual tithers. Do you know the average financial giving to the church for a parishioner is between 2 to 3% of their income? I mean, imagine if they all actually gave 10% of what is actually a tithe, of what a tithe is actually. I mean, if you know that the good news, people being transformed, going out, being incarnational, meeting the needs of others, discipling others, the expansion of the kingdom on earth here, you'll know that you are part of the mission of God here on earth. Take the risk and put first things first. Make it your church's top priority to make disciples. And I know it feels hard, and it might be tough in the beginning, but you don't have to have a fireworks show right away. Make it simple and easy. Be creative. And there are a lot of ways that you can do this. Here's one suggestion for how you can try it in your church. Make a list of about a dozen men and a dozen women, not too young. Older would be a fantastic advantage. And approach them and ask if they would be willing to have coffee with X, maybe every 2 weeks. Then go find X and put the two of them together. You can simply have sign-up sheets in the back of the church telling people to put down their names if they would like to have someone disciple them or mentor them or coach them, whatever you might want to call it. The ultimate aim is to just let someone's Christian life rub off on another so that they take one tiny Christ-maturing step towards being more like Jesus. It doesn't matter if you start very small. Just start. Now, if you can train your disciplers, that's great. But don't let that hold you up. Okay? And there's an X factor with the X. Okay? As we put it. As part of the agreement with the discipling process, the person being discipled must also commit to finding another person to disciple. Don't do it right away. But at some point, say, hey, maybe you should think about discipling, coaching, mentoring someone else. So that person does the same, and on and on. And pretty soon, Jesus returns. So, because that's how they did it. That's how our ancestors did it. I alluded to this earlier. Right? Because in AD, if you think about it for our ancestors, in AD 100, there were only about 25,000 Christians. By AD 313, when Constantine granted legal protection to Christianity, there were upwards of 20 million Christians. And how did they do this? How did they go from a small, cowardly, insignificant movement whose leader had just been crucified, the most heinous of deaths. How did they go from this to the most significant religious force in the Roman Empire in just 2 centuries? Christianity was an illegal religion. They had no church buildings to meet in. They didn't have the scriptures that we have today, just letters being passed around and books from the Old Testament. They didn't have any institutions, no denominations or seminaries for training, no advertising or marketing schemes. And they actually made it very difficult to join the church. I mean, besides the danger of joining, they had a significantly long period of initiation before they could see if you were worthy to join the church. And when others ran away, our Christian ancestors stayed during pandemics. Okay? I talk more about it in the book, but it was really interesting during times of the plagues in the first century. You would find that the rich would actually throw out their dead onto the streets, and even some who weren't dead yet. But they would just get that, and then they would flee to the hills, the rich, and they would, in open spaces with a lot of air going through, and they would just feast and have parties up there, but be away from that. And they would just leave their dead. They would leave the cities, but the people who didn't leave were the Christians. And the first century people noticed that. And they said, what's going on? They were blown away. They said, what would make a group of people do that? And then Christians talked about their fearlessness in death because of the sacrifice of one man, Jesus Christ, and their conviction in the resurrection and the life ever after. So, like 2 Timothy 2:2, they discipled their disciples who discipled others. That's what we want to see happening. And as I end, I want to bring your attention to some research that was done by Tom Rainer, a leading church growth researcher in the United States. He says that you now have to work 4 times as hard on something that you used to take for granted. That's one of the hardest things that I'm finding with pastors and leaders and churches, friends, is that this is just stuff they took for granted. And they are finding it hard to get back to working hard to make it work. In Tom's book, How Your Church Can Reach People in a Post-COVID World, he states that in his research, breakout churches, he calls them, tended to exert a 4-fold effort in reaching their communities. But it wasn't only just the church leaders, and that was key. But it was also the church members. And a lot of times, we don't think about that. We don't think, hey, we need to have everybody doing this. Everybody trying to be on board. Congregation helping out. People discipling each other, trying to talk to people who aren't coming back, or finding out why, or whatever it might be, putting in their energy, their finances, as much as possible. So often the leaders keep it amongst the leadership and say, what are we doing wrong? What do we need to do? When they should be trying to make it as wide with the body of Christ in their congregation. And you might be finding it very hard to deal with the lack of people coming back to church. And along with that, the lack of volunteers. And your job is much harder now than it used to be. One of the reasons is that you may still be trying to do all the things that you had done previously. Remember we talked about how you could cut things out, not doing the same things the same way, because remember that's the definition of insanity. So the people that are returning are weary, and most of them unfortunately just want to receive from church and not really volunteer for things. It's happening everywhere. And I don't know why, but volunteerism in South Africa has never been very high. On average, pre-pandemic numbers put volunteerism at about 3.5% of South Africans across all sectors. And in that small percentage, about 33% are volunteers for religious institutions. And what can be done about it? What can you do about it? And I don't really know. Our most active members are already volunteering to the max, and we're having to put even more duties and stuff on top of them. When will they break? Right? It's the thing that keeps us up at night. And I don't have a silver bullet for you, but maybe it does come back to disciple making. I mean, if you think it all the way through, if Christ, our rabbi, asked us to follow him for like a day, and we saw that in that day, he went around, he was sweeping up rubbish, washing dishes, counseling some people, pruning the hedges. Do you think we would sit there watching him and think, that's interesting that all that he's doing? And good for him. I see that good example for myself, and I'm just going to treasure it in my heart and just keep watching him work. We wouldn't do it, would we, if he was there? We would immediately get in there and start helping him, start doing what he was doing, making sure we were doing our best to be like him, like Christ. We wouldn't even need to be told. So that's what I'm offering. It comes back to how discipled our people are. You might remember when there were some new converts maybe in your church, and they were eager to do anything and everything. And maybe we need to find a way to spark that fire again within our own people. And I really don't think that repeating and hammering at them to volunteer is going to get the job done. There has to be a transformation of the heart, which hopefully leads to a transformation of their hands and feet. One of the things that we did at one of my church plants was to have like a party picnic and call it Volunteer Day. And we always sought to make them feel appreciated, not taken advantage of. Servanthood is hard, and not everyone has it. And most will feel used at some point. Make them feel the most special. Everyone thinks it's the pastor who should get all the glory, but you go and make sure it's the volunteer who gets all the acclaim, okay? Thank them publicly and often, and maybe you'll get more involvement, okay? So again, you'll see in this slide, it's basically what that Timothy, those verses were about, okay? Multiplication is infinitely greater than addition. And I presented the case to you today, whether you're going to be a church interrupted and wait out the storm until years from now when everything sort of is normal. Or if you're going to see this as a great opportunity for God to reset ourselves as the body of Christ here on earth and go out and make disciples. Disciples that might very well transform our nation and even our world. I believe we are poised on the doorstep of this opportunity to shape the conversation around making disciples who become totally committed to transforming themselves and their world. We are chosen to stand in the gap, to emphasize and implement a holistic transformation of people who will truly be Christ followers and reset our churches and our communities. So, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Wasn't as long as I thought it would be. I look forward to seeing many of you on the 17th at 10:30, I believe. If you'd like to order the books, here is the email address. They are only 100 Rand each. But then there are the costs to courier it to you. So if you email, we'll send you back the different options of how we can get the book to you. Okay? But please send an email to postcovidchurch@gmail.com. Thank you, and be blessed.